talks, because we now live in an era where Zoom is a huge piece of it, and Zoom fatigue is also a huge piece of it. They have done some interesting research that shows that Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and that and neurologically what happens is watching me talk on camera, even though it looks very much like lifelike, there's a microsecond or two that it's off. And your brain registers that and tries to make sense of it. And so it actually will cause you to feel a little more fatigued. This is all in a way of giving you permission, in case you don't give yourself permission, to take some time off during the presentation. You can close your eyes, you can listen. I've assured Lada that I am going to give you the link to this Prezi. So you will be able to take a look at it anytime you want. This is Zoom, so the transitions will slide or get bigger, and there's a lot of multimedia stuff in here, including some stuff that is auditory. So at any time, if you feel like you need to take a break, you feel free to do that, and you'll be able to come back to it later. So a lot of us are putting in a little extra time after a day's work of looking at people benignly and empathically, and that really does take a toll. So that is my disclaimer about Prezi. So the title of this is Video Games and Psychodynamic Psychotherapy, Opening a Window to Play in Treatment. And I want to start by basically giving you a sense of who I am. This is my reminder to introduce me. So I have been in private practice since 1997, and I've been working with kids all that time. And I've been playing video games with kids all that time. Back when I was working in the inner city district special education departments, we didn't care how kids learned. We didn't care how kids were willing to come to school. And so when kids started wanting to play Nintendo in school, we had no problem doing it because it was a way of getting them engaged. So when I say I'm an early adopter, I really am an early adopter. I was almost entirely virtual before COVID hit, so I have the advantage of having had the chance to learn how to do video game-based treatment prior to being forced to do it. And so hopefully I'm going to be sharing a couple of vignettes towards the end where I can talk with you a little bit about how the clinical piece went. If you have questions about the pragmatic stuff, you certainly can let me know as well. Here's the agenda for tonight. I'm going to, and fair warning, I've got a lot of slides, so I'm probably going to go at a pretty good pace. And I'm going to start by talking about a few theoretical aspects of play from psychodynamic theory. In particular, we're going to focus on Freud and Winnicott, but we're going to talk about theoretical aspects of technology as well. Also, someone might want to mute themselves because I could just hear someone. We're going to talk about countertransference responses to video games, and we're going to talk about theoretical aspects of the video game play form. Then I'm going to go into the two case examples, and the difference that I want to make clear is that one of them is working with a patient outside of the video game, meaning where the video game was an object of therapeutic discussion and focus, and engaging in the game happened outside of treatment on both the part of myself and the patient. The other example is a case example of working with the patient within the video game play form, meaning that part of the play therapy was video games. Now, I am curious, and I'm not sure, and I can't see, but I would be curious about how many of you are doing play therapy. And I'm also curious about how many of you are doing play therapy with adults. So we'll talk about, I'll ask you that when we all come back as a group. But for now, I want us to get started with talking about play. And I did a little bit of lit review about play. Before I get to that, though, I do want to talk about Elizabeth Rosenberg-Zetzel. Some of you may have actually met Elizabeth Rosenberg-Zetzel. She was a psychoanalytic clinician in the Boston area in, I believe, the 50s and 60s and 70s. Elizabeth Rosenberg-Zetzel, there's this great story about her, which is she used to work with her patients in a very traditional psychoanalytic room in her practice. And Elizabeth would smoke during her sessions. And occasionally a patient would ask Elizabeth, can I smoke during our sessions? To which Elizabeth would say, no, you may not. Occasionally of those patients, a few would be brave enough to say, well, why can you smoke in here, but I can't? To which Elizabeth would reply, because in therapy, anything that makes me less anxious and you more anxious is a good thing. And I mention that because when we talk about countertransference, you're going to sort of probably get a glimpse of my overarching agenda with you all, which is the less anxious you are about using technology and using video games and play, the easier you're going to have a time of it paying attention with that sort of evenly suspended attention that Freud used to talk about. So let's try not to be anxious about technology. So let's talk about play. If you go to PepWeb and you read, the wonderful thing about PepWeb, talking about geeking out, is that you can put in any search term and it will tell you every single time it's ever showed up. So for Freud, when you plug in the search term play, you find that for Freud, play has these basic purposes in developmental order, roughly. So Freud thinks of play first and foremost as discharging libido through masturbation. The first form of play that we have is learning to literally play with ourselves. That is the beginning of Freud's understanding and conception of play. Now, hopefully we go on from there. According to Freud, the second goal of play is to sublimate masturbatory behavior, that roughly around the same age that children enter into the Oedipal stage, they need to learn to start sublimating some of these drives, and that includes masturbatory behavior. So for play, for Freud, provides that function, that it sublimates that. Moving further, play allows you to express the wish to be a grown-up safely. So this is an example, of someone managing to express the wish to be the person in charge, the doctor in charge. And that is, for Freud, the third developmental place that we arrive with play. And again, just like we often don't turn a critical eye onto those psychoanalytic thinkers that are always publishing about themselves and their female patient with erotic transference. And very rarely do people go, why is it that all of these, I think, heterosexual analysts are always talking about their patients falling in love with them? But we also want to point out that therapists often talk about children expressing wishes to be a grown-up, as if being a grown-up is a good thing. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily any more accurate than the constant assumption that we need to talk about our patients falling in love with us. But for Freud, that is the fourth reason that people play. It's a way they want to become an adult. And mastering conflict through fantasies is the next reason that for Freud, play has any function. It is designed so that we aren't actually killing each other or having internal conflicts, but that we can actually use fantasy to negotiate those. Now, at some point, we move into adulthood, according to Freud. Now, Freud is basically saying, if you're a grown-up and, quote, cannot come to terms with the renunciation of instinctual satisfaction, which adulthood at first demands, you allow your erotic and ambitious wishes to have full play in the life of fantasy, then you become an actor. So for Freud, the first way an adult who can't renunciate their drives or stop playing manages to do play is to become an actor or an artist. So Freud didn't quite call artists psychotic, at least not in the literature I reviewed, but he clearly talks about how the play function is understandable psychodynamically through people that are expressing their wish to live in fantasy a good part of the time by engaging in art. And last but not least, the rest of us well-adjusted people that want to play as adults. This sublimation of these earlier drives forms behaviors such as card games, theater, and dry humor. Okay, so, and chess. Those were the things that Freud mentioned that adult, non-neurotic men could do. Women, he didn't really mention, at least in the lit review. But the idea was that the best we can hope for in terms of play is to become like men in the Victorian era, which is to play card games, go to the theater, and engage in witty verbal banter. And that means we will have successfully mastered our instincts and drives and be using play in appropriate ways for civilization. Now, I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek. I imagine that if Freud was here today, he might have some extra things to add, but that's actually what the Lit Review says when you look at Freud's views on play. There were very few things that he found socially acceptable. So we're going to talk about Winnicott in a sec, but I want to get you into thinking about technology. And for doing that, we're going to just take a couple of minutes. Normally I do this as a group activity, but I want to keep moving along. I want you to take a minute. You can close your eyes if you want and think about these three questions. I want you to think about what technology you took for granted as a child. What technology was cutting edge when you were a late teen, young adult? And what technology have you plateaued at? Are you like Twitter? Absolutely not. I'm not going to do Instagram. Where have you plateaued? So just take a second, try to remember each of these technologies, ones that you took for granted, ones that were cutting edge, and ones that you just want nothing to do with. And when you've come up with some answers to this, I just want to take one or maybe two volunteers to share with the group what these technologies are. So you may need to ask permission to unmute. You may need to, raise your hand or something.
Yes, anyone, feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand if you want to share.
What are some what technology did you take for granted as a child?
All right, we have Ketel.
Okay.
Well, so I'm a child of the 80s. So I think what I took for granted was, well, the telephone attached to the wall, right? The record player, the TV, but maybe before remote control. So that's some of that I took for granted. I think when I was a late teen, young adult was right when personal computers were starting to be used. Like I remember learning in college about email and the web, but like super, super, super early. Mm-hmm. And then cell phones, actually later, I guess young adulthood cell phones. And then technology I've plateaued at. Yeah, I mean, I'm really conversant with Facebook and Instagram, and WhatsApp, right? And Zoom, of course, but that's about it. Like when I hear about Twitch or I hear even like TikTok, mm-hmm. Like I don't, it's a little intimidating. So.
Okay. Thanks, Ketel, for being brave and going first. I've got time for one more.
I was going to speak up, but I had basically the same things.
Well, you can specify, Lottie. Did you have a rotary phone or a touch tone phone? Yeah,
right. So we had a rotary phone, and then it became kind of cutting edge when we started using the touch tone phone. And I remember the Commodore 64 someone came to our house and started playing with that and showed my mom and my dad and my brother. I've definitely plateaued at Facebook. Like Facebook is the only thing I use. I have never been on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, or anything like that. I see it on kind of like, kids nowadays, stupid stuff that they're doing. But I also know Facebook was exactly the same thing to my parents' generation. So it's interesting to reflect on.
Okay, thank you. I want people that even if you didn't answer, chances are you had an image or two of the particular phones or the particular technology or what the TV looked like or what the PC looked like. Um, and part of why I bring this in at the beginning is to sort of help really help you sort of become conscious of some visceral relationships you have with technology. You might want to check in to see what, if any, emotional associations you had with things. I can still envision.
Pieces following you.
Oh, sorry, someone needs to mute. We can hear you. So we really do have attachments to technology. We actually have object relations to technology. And one example, I can remember the phone that was in the kitchen area that had the really long cord, and me sitting in the hall, and it was this mustard color. And there were so many agonizing adolescent crushy conversations that happened on that phone, which I now cringe about because I was having to have them in the kitchen because, of course, at that point, we didn't have smartphones. But that informed my idea of what adolescence is, what privacy is or is not allowed, and the level of access we have. And we're going to get to that in a second. So when we talk about technology, we don't necessarily just mean computers. Technology is anything that human beings make to further human projects. This is technology doing double time. You may remember this picture from Castaway. It was Wilson, who is actually a wonderful example of a transitional object that Tom Hanks used to cope. And Wilson was originally a ball, and was used for both being a ball and then later being a companion. But all of those things, playing and companionship, are human projects, and we use technology to amplify our ability to engage in them. Now, technology, for the purpose of our talk today, does three things. So the first thing technology does is it collapses time and space. And this is one of my favorite examples. Oops, we're going to stick with this. So this is a picture of the known universe from the Hubble space, I think, telescope, or it could be the Hubble, it could be a satellite. But my point is the same, which is this is actually a picture of the known universe. That is an example of how time and space get collapsed, how we can actually see all of these images, all of these stars and galaxies, all within one screen, some of which are no longer in existence. But we have captured them using technology so that we've collapsed time so that we can actually see stars and systems that no longer exist. The second thing technology in general does is it amplifies ideas. And here's an example of a very famous or infamous idea that it amplified a few years back. Oops, hold on, let me see. Oh, yep, I got it right. So I hope you could hear the volume there. Do you remember that, gentlemen?
I could not hear the volume, but I could read the text.
Okay, you couldn't hear the volume. That's a problem. So I'm not sure why I can't share the volume, but this was basically Mitt Romney. And for those of you who may or may not remember, Mitt Romney was caught record. Thanks, Amy. I can now see that. And I'm not sure how to fix the audio, so that may be a problem for a couple of things. Oh, you may have to unshare, reshare your screen. Oh, thank you, Sarah. Hold on. Who knew I could do that? So unshare. I'm going to unshare my screen and then, okay, share. See, see, this is, I always lean, you think, there we go. All right, let's.
7% of Americans pay no income tax.
Can you hear it now?
So our message of low taxes doesn't connect. And you'll be out there talking about tax cuts for the rich. I mean, that's what they sell every 4 years. And so my job is not to worry about those people. I'll never convince them that they should take personal responsibility and care for their life.
So that's an example of how an emerging technology amplified an idea that someone didn't necessarily want. So as you may recall, someone had brought in a smartphone and recorded video footage of this. And this idea may have been one of the major things that cost Mitt Romney that election. And that couldn't have happened 2 decades earlier when the party line couldn't stretch from my kitchen to Mitt Romney and couldn't actually record anything. So this is an example of how technology amplifies ideas. So it doesn't just collapse space and time, but it amplifies ideas. All right. And then the last thing technology does is technology provides access.
Today I accomplished the goal that I set before the surgery even took place. They were asking if there was something special I wanted to do, like touch my children's cheek or hold my husband's hand, and I said, my goal is to feed myself chocolate. And I did that today.
So what you're seeing is someone who is quadriplegic and has connected directly into her brain an interface that operates that robotic arm. And her, the quote in here that to me embodies this in technology is, and I did that today. That technology allows her access to experiences of being human that she couldn't necessarily experience on her own. A sense of increased independence, a sense of access to motion. These are other pieces that when you think of technology in general, it causes for human beings. So again, technology collapses space and time, it amplifies ideas, and it provides access. So those are things in general about technology. But let's talk about how technology begins with play. All technology, all ability, all phenomena where human beings use technology outside of themselves to amplify themselves starts with the play instinct. So for example, this is a stick. Maybe it's a stick. To a dog, it's probably a stick. To my dog, it's definitely a stick. However, a stick is not just a stick, to paraphrase Sigmund. Sometimes a stick can be something else. It can be a magic wand. It can be a sword. It can be a gun. It can be your nose. It can be something else. That ability to take something that is an object and amplify what it does and use it to further a human project through play creates something, reveals other meanings to what a stick is. So that's an example of how play is inherently necessary to technology. And play and technology have a very symbiotic relationship. So Winnicott talked about play and had some really interesting things, as some of you probably know, to say about it. And one of the things that I think is most important that Winnicott said is, it's good to remember always that playing is itself a therapy. To arrange for children to be able to play is itself a psychotherapy that has immediate and universal application, and it includes the establishment of a positive social attitude towards playing. And those are my italics, because I think we have a crisis in our field in general, at least in the US in particular, about play. That play is something you outgrow, play is something that is immature, that play has to be something that it has some sort of demonstrable value in terms of play therapy. It needs to be in the service of therapy. But Winnicott reminds us that actually just creating a space where people can play allows us to open that neurological phenomena that is play, so that we can look at the same thing in different ways, experience increased flexibility in thinking. And there's numerous benefits of play that I think we as therapists sometimes are very reluctant to acknowledge or accept. These are some of the many examples of play. And for, like Winnicott again talks about, I want to draw attention away from the sequence psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, play material, playing, and to set this up again the other way around. In other words, it is play that's the universal, and that belongs to health. Playing facilitates growth and therefore health. Playing leads into group relationships. Playing can be a form of communication in psychotherapy. And lastly, psychoanalysis has been developed as a very highly specialized form of play in the service of communication with one and others. So Winnicott's really firing a shot across the bow of psychoanalysis here when he basically talks about, no, it shouldn't be that you're using play therapy to enhance psychoanalysis, as if that was the point. Psychoanalysis is in fact a form of play that hopefully will get us back to more basic elements of play. Now, one of the reasons something has predated and will probably post-date psychodynamic psychotherapy like play is because its universality. If you look here, there are several different aspects of the play form that you can see. And it's very different than what you see here. So this is an example of some of the Smith School for Social Work alumni pictures that I absconded. They have them available in the library to alums. And this is an example of what play therapy and play in education looks like. So when in this sort of is where Winnicott says there's a possibility that in the total theory of the personality, the psychoanalyst has been too busy using play content to look at the playing child and to write about play as a thing in itself. And Winnicott was always very clear that playing needs to be studied as a subject on its own, supplementary to the concept of sublimation of the instinct. So you do not want to look at this picture and go, look at all these people doing a good job at not masturbating in public. Look at how well they're mastering their drives. You want to look at this and say, gee, who looks like they're having fun here? And who looks like they may be missing the boat? Who looks like they are excited? And who in this picture looks like they are afraid of excitement? Who looks like they're anxious about experiencing excitement in this social interaction? So the 5 rules of play. These are from a man named Johannes Huizinga, who wrote a book called Homo Ludens. I recommend it highly. And Johannes Huizinga said that there were 5 things that play shares. All play has these things. So one is that play is free. It's in fact freedom. No one can hold a gun to your head and say you have to play Monopoly, and that will be play. Okay. Also, play is not ordinary or real life. Play happens in a transitional space, and it is set apart from. Play is distinct from ordinary life, both as to locality and duration. And that although play is free, it creates order. It is order. Play demands order, absolute and supreme. There are rules in games. There are rules in play. And then play is connected with no material interest, and no profit can be gained from it. If you are gambling, you are not playing. So when we talk about therapy as play, freedom also means being free to quit. And one of the most important questions you can ask a patient is not, do you want to quit? When you're talking about whether it be video games or talking about substance abuse or talking about a particular pattern of dysfunction in their lives. The first important question is not, do you want to quit, but do you feel free to quit? And the reason I'm mentioning that connection between therapy and play is because both therapy and play require what we call the illusory attitude. So the illusory attitude was a term coined by a man named Bernard Suits. And the illusory attitude is basically that play is the voluntary attempt to overcome an unnecessary obstacle. And so I couldn't think of a better example, even though I don't play it, than using golf. Golf is entirely the voluntary attempt to overcome an unnecessary obstacle. If the goal of golf was to get the ball in the hole, you'd make a much smaller ball. You'd make a much bigger hole. You'd be able to use your hand and just go drop it in the hole. You wouldn't have to hit it with a stick. And you wouldn't put another stick there that it could bounce off of. This makes absolutely no sense if the goal is to basically get the ball in the hole. What we have to do in order to make this play is to make these obstacles unnecessary, okay, but present. So we need to make the ball a certain size. We need to make the hole very small. We need to have the course have 16 holes that you need to hit with a stick. All of those things aren't necessary to get the ball in the hole. They're unnecessary obstacles, which people agree to attempt because it creates a play state. It creates the illusory attitude. Now, what does this have in common with therapy? Well, therapy is the voluntary attempt to overcome an unnecessary obstacle, by which I mean our neurotic conflicts, our dysfunctional patterns, the things that maybe were useful as survival skills at one point, but are no longer necessary, that have become unnecessary obstacles to us. So when someone comes in to see you, on some level, they have to agree to attempt to play the game of therapy. They have to agree to the rules of the game of therapy, what the play form looks like, who's in charge. And the therapist needs to do that too. Okay, it's a 45-minute session. It's not a 32-minute session or a 5-day long session. Those are unnecessary obstacles. Those are artificial rules that we put in together to create a play space. Now, Winnicott went on to say that play is immensely exciting. It is exciting not primarily because the instincts are involved, be it understood. The thing about playing is always the precariousness of the interplay of personal psychic reality and the experience of control of actual objects. So what makes play playful is it becomes the space where your interpersonal, your personal psychic reality and the world outside of your psychic reality have a chance to kind of interplay in a way that's looser and more creative than in day-to-day life. So I'm going to give you an example now of this precarious state of interplay. The metaphor is the child at play and the arrival of the therapist. And if you're a Harry Potter fan, you'll probably remember this particular flick. Okay, that one says it all. That thunder, that thundering noise is the arrival of the therapist. There are those kids engaging in their interplay. That sort of Patronus is a perfect example of the interplay between one's inner psychic world and manifesting in the material. And then the analytic gaze comes upon play, and play stops being play if we're not careful. Playing has a time and place. It's not inside, nor is it outside. Winnicott talks more about how it is not a part of the repudiated world, the not me, which the individual has decided to recognize with whatever difficulty and even pain is truly external, which is outside magical control. Play is in between. So these are the Stranger Things kids, if you followed that series. This is a most wonderful example of excitement that kids experience when they're playing. And it's an excitement that by and large, a large group of our colleagues are afraid of. We have been, and it makes sense if you think back to our sort of Victorian legacy. If you really think that play and getting excited is sublimated impulses to masturbate and that's it, then we better not get excited when we're doing therapy with anyone, least of all children. Therapy needs to be serious business. It needs to not be exciting to the therapist. We need to be observers and dispassionate. So Winnicott further says the content does not matter. What matters is the near withdrawal state, akin to the concentration of older children and adults. The playing child inhabits an area that cannot be easily left, nor can it easily admit its intrusions. And I want to give you an example of that sort of state, where I want to invite you to watch this particular video, enjoy the playfulness of it, which is all about slowing down a particular moment, and see if you can let yourself both focus on what you're seeing and let yourself wander and let yourself experience some of the sensory excitement of this particular video. Some of you may have totally become immersed in that and all of those sensory things, and some of you may have been confused, and some of you may have been thinking to yourself, that was totally unnecessary. Why was that? Why did they do that? Why did he show that to us? And the reason I showed it to you was an attempt to evoke a state of playful concentration. The reason they did that, you're absolutely right. If you're thinking that, it was totally unnecessary, just like Rube Goldberg machines used to be totally unnecessary. If there are those of you that may remember Rube Goldberg machines, it was this, the sort of long, elaborate, hammers and springs and all these things that would just get you from pushing a button to getting some toast. That is what the play state does. It creates this set of unnecessary obstacles. But I hope you also noticed how much fun they were having. And one of the fun things about Zoom is I can watch you watching this video, and some of you were very much interested in smiling and your mirror neurons were working. So it is clearly possible to evoke a play state like this. Let's contrast it with this play state, also courtesy of the Smith School for Social Work archives. Because in play therapy, a lot of times the therapist thinks their role is to interpret. And as Winnicott said, interpretation outside of the ripeness of material is indoctrination and produces compliance. A corollary to this is that resistance arises out of interpretation, given outside of the area of the overlap and the patient and analysis playing together. So Winnicott's actually saying a couple of interesting things here. One is he's saying that interpretation takes you out of the therapeutic moment. And he's also saying that getting out of the therapeutic moment is actually what causes often patient resistance. So does anybody look like they're having fun here? Does anybody look like they're experiencing any excitement? She doesn't look like she's having too much fun. She doesn't look like she's having too much fun. They're busy interpreting. They're busy preparing in their head what their epic note is going to be, or whatever they're going to have to write to justify to insurance companies. And certainly this poor little one, doesn't look like they're necessarily having a lot of fun. Now, we don't know the whole context of this, but one interpretation is that the play has gone out of play therapy. I can guarantee you when I play games, video games with my patients, they do not look like this. Playing implies trust and belongs to the potential space between. Okay, that's why we have Winnicott playing his squiggle game. Now, I love this picture of Winnicott because he looks a lot more engaged, even though he's not necessarily doing the drawing. And what Winnicott always talked about was the immediacy and presence between the therapist and the patient. Psychotherapy takes place in the overlap of these two areas. Again, you see some engagement, you see some support. I'm going to push a little bit faster just because I want to get us to actually video games. So let's start. Normally we end with countertransference when we talk about stuff, but I want to start with it. So let's talk about some epic therapist fails, some countertransference responses people have with video games. One is technophobia. People will just, I'm not going to use Discord. It's just too, I'm sure I'd do something stupid. People that are bored, when the therapist expresses boredom, the therapist will dismiss the subject, and often the communication of boredom and dismissal goes like this. Oh, I don't know anything about video games. I don't know anything about Facebook. I don't have an Instagram account. Okay, those are actually unconscious or sometimes preconscious communications of boredom and dismissal. Okay, if your patients are coming in week after week expressing some excitement about Discord or Twitch, and you catch yourself saying, oh, I don't know anything about Discord or Twitch, well, then you'd better go look up what Discord and Twitch are, and you better do some research, because that's what meeting the patient where they're at is. To sort of communicate this sort of faux regret, which is, oh, I don't know anything about, is actually expressing some countertransference of dismissal. On the other hand, you can be like me, and you can over-identify with the patient if you do game. So if I'm playing a game that has a certain number of levels or a certain score, and a patient comes in and starts talking about their playing the game, and I suddenly say, what level are you on? Not because I'm interested in the patient's sake, but because I'm actually interested in in competing. Oops. Then dismissals of other subjects if you do game. So for example, when people talk about football or the Super Bowl, or as I call it, football time, I try very hard not to call it football time with patients, because I know that's my communication of dismissal. Anytime we prefer one activity over the other, we run the risk of countertransference. By the way, one of the places I see this the most predominant is working with kids and young adults on the spectrum, or kids with autism. This idea of perseveration, which is such a subjective thing. If any of you were to start talking with me about People Magazine, Kanye West, or football time, and you started talking about it for more than 10 seconds, I would be inclined to think you were perseverating, because I find it extremely tedious and boring. And unfortunately, a lot of times our subjective meters aren't necessarily accurate. So we really want to be careful when we talk about people having a hyper focus or being perseverated, because the other possibility is that we have an aversion to that. So those are some things that I see when I consult with folks that are working with gamers. Those are things that I struggle with sometimes myself. The other thing that I often see and talk with people about when their parents or educators or therapists about video games is the difference between the over-the-shoulder attitude of video games and the immersive attitude. If you have a kid or a loved one that plays video games and you don't play, this is probably what it looks like to you. You see this image on a television set, you see the individual extremely focused on that screen. That's what you see, as opposed to what the gamer is experiencing, which is being in a laboratory. There's a door over there. How do I get to that door? This is actually the object of their focus. And so a lot of times I encourage parents to not use the over-the-shoulder attitude with kids and actually play a game to experience some of the challenge of it. So another thing I hear a lot from parents and educators and sometimes therapists is that video games are a form of escapism. And what if it's not? You know, first off, escaping isn't a bad thing. Escaping has a sort of a moral overtone of cowardice and avoidance. But what if we took a more affirming stance? What if gaming is actually a form of concentration meditation? Sometimes people may be playing video games to relax and unwind, but sometimes people are using video games as a way of creating flow experiences or even form of concentration meditation. Many of you may have tried concentration meditation by focusing on a mandala or a candle or a chant or even your breath. But video games can be used in a very similar way, which is to evoke a concentrative meditative state. All right, so let's talk about the uncanny, because the other thing video games do, and this is a screenshot of a game called Minecraft, which some of you may be familiar with, is video games evoke a form of uncanniness. So I want to back up a little bit here and sort of make sure we're all on the same page. Video games are an art form. Okay, whether you like the art form or not, video games are a media form that is an art form. And art always reveals something about what it means to be human. And for art to work, it needs to be based on a model of the real world. A game can be regarded as a dynamic model of reality, in which the model provides a representation of reality. So for example, if you look at Donkey Kong here, these barrels are modeled on a barrel. We need to know that it's a barrel. If video games had no meaningful reference to the world we live in, they would be unable to provide any form of escape or entertainment, okay? We need to know that a hammer is a hammer. They need to resemble our experience without being seen as identical. So we know that you want to approach, that Donkey Kong and a gorilla are both similar, but also different. Video games allow us to experience being thrown into a new world where things take on a life of their own, where fire comes alive and moves around. We're always just visiting in video games. We're always strangers in a strange land, but within the game world, things like magic are real, and our decisions and actions quickly and can often permanently change the world. So for example, in Minecraft, if you chop down a tree, it stays chopped down. If you build a house, it stays built until someone blows it up with TNT. So our friend Freud again, he talked about how the uncanny was a specific type of fear, something that was both strange and familiar. I'm going to just flip over that particular video, because I think it would just take up time. I want to make sure we use for other things. The uncanny is basically repetitive, which makes the world suddenly seem both stranger and more meaningful. So in games where there is a play world there are patterns, and seeing these patterns can make us feel both more in touch with meaning, but also feel more like we are not at home in the world. In fact, uncanny in German is unheimlich. It translates literally to the unhomely or the unhomelike. The uncanny is both alien and a revelation or an exposure. And Freud says that the uncanny or the unheimlich is the name for everything that ought to have remained secret and hidden, but has come to light. In the uncanny world, the apparent death and reanimation of the dead are fairly commonplace, just like in Minecraft, where there's lots of skeletons and zombies. And the uncanny world is characterized by the prompt fulfillment of wishes and with secret injurious powers. If you want to hurl a fireball at somebody in real life, you can't do it. But in World of Warcraft, you can. Anything can happen in the uncanny world at first. It just doesn't seem to make sense. So video games are ways, can not only be these uncanny worlds, but they can provide ways, if you play them or if you're familiar with them, to explain to patients psychodynamic concepts, developmental tasks at hand, and family conflict in less confrontational ways. So one of my favorite examples is to explain the unconscious to patients. Our brains roughly are processing about 11 million bits of information per second, yet we are only conscious of 40 bits. So 40 out of 11 million bits of what you are processing right now is what you're conscious of. So for example, if you look at this image, which is made of pixels, and you were to look at the red dot, just nod if you can see the red dot here. Look closely. I'll give you a hint. It's in the upper left corner. Okay, that left dot is 40 bits. But wait, this picture is actually only 5 million bits. So the real representation of the unconscious would be finding those 40 bits in this 11 million bits of a picture. Now, what's the point of this? The point of this is to help explain to parents why every time they come into the room and ask their kiddo, are you doing your homework? They're actually fighting for those 40 bits. This is another model that I think would be useful for you to keep in mind when you're thinking about the unconscious, because I think the unconscious here is actually in Freud's original diagram is a little bit optimistic. So let's talk about a case. I'm going to talk with you about a case where I worked with a young man, and we played video games, but not together. We played them separately on our own time. But most importantly, it's about how I managed to get the magnificent legendary sword named Onigoroshi. And this is my character in the game Path of Exile, and you can see me holding Onigoroshi. That's Onigoroshi. Now, Onigoroshi is a very hard sword to get. In order to get it, you have to kill a boss in the very first section of the game Path of Exile, a section people usually go right through. And in fact, you have to do it multiple times until the game randomly drops the sword. And when I say randomly drops, it can take days or weeks. So the patient that I'm talking about, we'll call him Jerome, was a 22-year-old cisgender male, self-referred with the help of parents after he disappeared literally from school and life. He was going to a local technological institute. And one semester, he just left school. He got overwhelmed with school and what was going on there. And he was, rather than tell his parents that he was feeling overwhelmed and feeling like a failure, he disappeared. He took his car and he drove away from the campus, and he lived in his car for approximately a month without telling anybody. His parents had no idea where he was. And it wasn't until he finally showed up at their door and moved back into the house that he basically started to access treatment. Now, interestingly, Jerome reached out to me by email several times over a month or two before he finally was able to commit to making an appointment. He was diagnosed prior to seeing me as having Crohn's. He was also diagnosed by me with depression. He'd left his last treatment after no shows and cancels. His parents were very frustrated. And one unsuccessful attempt to return to school, they did the thing where, try to do a community college over the summer. Just was met with failure. He had a lot of sleep dysregulation and anhedonia, and he played a lot of the game I just talked with you about, Path of Exile. Other than Path of Exile, he had very decreased exercise and motivation. He had some real passive resistance, although he could be very insightful. And he anticipated that I was going to be resistant and disinterested in video games, just like his parents were, just like the previous therapist had been. Well, was he in for a surprise? Because in fact, I did play Path of Exile. And I was familiar with Onigoroshi, which, just so you know, the reason Onigoroshi is such an exciting legendary sword is it has these 6 sockets. If you look at the lower right-hand corner, it has 6 linked sockets. Now, each of those sockets allows you to have a power that will connect and amplify the other powers. And again, this is an example of an unnecessary obstacle. Why do we need to have these linked? Why can there be only 6? Well, in the game, normally having 4 linked sockets is a big deal. So what made Onigoroshi so valuable was it had 6. And he was telling me about, we were talking about this sword, and we were talking about it largely because he was finding himself intrigued and frustrated with a particular friend of his that he played games with. And the friend he was frustrated with was, he spent 8 hours, this friend, only doing this repetitive gameplay to get that sword. That whereas Jerome was always interested in progressing further and with new levels and with the novelty, this other guy did what we call grinding, where he just kept grinding the same level over and over again until he got the sword. And so what was interesting for us when we talked was that Jerome both was admiring this guy, but also annoyed and confused. He couldn't empathically connect with why you would spend so much time doing something so boring. So we discussed this in terms of his own anhedonia and his own low object cathexis, that he had very little interest in taking care of himself, and he very quickly lost interest in other things. And this lack of interest was so uncomfortable and intolerable to him that he would constantly pursue novelty. And so I saw this as an opportunity for modeling. And I said, well, I've been playing this game, as you know, so you know what, I think I'm going to farm for Onigoroshi until I get it. And he was like, are you serious? I was like, yeah, why not? Let's, how long can it take? Okay, well, it actually took probably 3 weeks. So I wasn't playing for 3 weeks straight, but over the next 3 weeks, our sessions would start with him checking in on my progress. Was I still farming for Onigoroshi? Had I gotten it yet? And this became an entree into psychoeducation about the interplay between low object cathexis, anhedonia, and motivation in his life. That he got to watch somebody persist in doing something, even though it was sometimes really boring. He would be like, don't you get bored? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, I'm looking forward to getting it so I can get to the next levels. But, I'm not going to die of boredom. Jerome, no one ever died of boredom. So this, the day I got it, or rather the week I got it, when we went back into the session, he actually got to experience some vicarious excitement. And I experienced some excitement when I got it and in the telling of this story to him. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because neither the patient nor the therapist in this case died or did anything that was malpractice just because we both got excited together in a session. But here was an example of both of us experiencing excitement and invigoration over a number of pixels on a screen that to the outside observer, you might be thinking, my God, what a waste of time. You could have written a sonnet, or you could have, written a book in that time. But within the experience of talking about this play state, we were able to experience some of that residual affect from the play state. This is me taking a screenshot of my getting the sword. That's how happy I was. Now, it's before we move on, it's safe to say Jerome is still in treatment with me. He has started working for his father's company. His sleep has improved, although it's by no means perfect. He's actually climbed and fallen off of the Alps at least once, and is now doing all sorts of other things that people would say is progress, and that Jerome would say is progress. And he's been able to understand and work through his symptoms of anhedonia, largely because we have a common language now for him to understand it. And he continues to meet with me weekly. And I have to say that he had a cancellation rate or a no-show rate at the beginning of our work together that was abysmal. And in fact, he would keep reenacting that time that he disappeared for a month, and that he would not show up for an appointment and not tell me he was not showing up and pay his bill, and not show up the next week and not tell me and pay his bill. And this has actually decreased over time by our talking about it, processing it. And in fact, in some ways, that was his version of grinding through the game. The second case I wanted to talk with you about is a case where I actually used gaming within the therapy rather than just using it as an object of shared experience. And this is a patient of mine, we'll call him Alan, who was referred to me at 12. He had low grades, family conflict, verbal abuse of his mom, physically aggressive and posturing, usually when dad, who frequently traveled for work, was away. Alan would be verbally and occasionally physically abusive to his sibling. He had a lot of sleep dysregulation and irritability, and they referred him to me because mom was convinced it was too many video games, that it was video games that was causing all of these problems. So first off, I intervened on a family level with them. I said, please watch my videos. If you are coming to me to get him to stop playing video games or reduce time spent playing video games, I'm the wrong therapist for you. I am not at all about getting people to quit video games. In fact, I think more people should play more often. I destigmatized technology use by educating them about some of the things they were concerned about. I supported increasing bandwidth in the home as developmentally appropriate. Part of where there were conflicts happening was because they had 2 adults and 2 adolescents all using the lowest bandwidth plan of internet. And if you want to find one really quick way to get family conflict to decrease remarkably, get a higher cable plan so that everyone can watch Netflix or stream or do whatever they're doing. And this actually models and parallels the adolescents' increasing need for separation, individuation, increasing dependence on parents only as a source of income and access to things. You know, if we think to adolescents, parents are basically ATMs on wheels. They provide money and transportation. And in this case, the family needed to provide transportation on the information highway in order for the family to get unstuck with the conflict about bandwidth. And in doing so, I also intervened with the family by helping them understand that digital literacies and needs are normal, that all families use technology in one form or another, and that kids need it now for school in ways that maybe the parents didn't need it at the same time. So our first interventions, before the family I even agreed to work with them, was the family needed to understand what my take on technology was. Now, the way I use technology for them over the course of treatment, the parents read my blog and they watched my videos for psychoeducation. I used Minecraft initially with Alan to sort of facilitate that I understood what video games were and how to play with them. We used the internet to get him on task with doing chores. There was a website called Chore Wars where you could actually kids could sign up and they would actually have their chores presented in a way that was very gamified. And because these folks were still using the charts with the stickers, and please don't use charts with stickers. No kid in the 21st century has any interest in the graphics of charts and stickers. They're very low value food. Alan would come in and use YouTube on his cell phone to show me music. And he would use the smartphone to negotiate time concerns with him. He was very worried about when the session would end. And so he wanted to have his access to his phone so he could see what time it was. But last but not least, the one I want to talk about the most was we played lots of Call of Duty. And I have to tell you, I hate Call of Duty. Now, for those of you who don't know what Call of Duty is, it's a first-person shooter game. And I hated it. I really didn't like playing this game, not because of the first person shooter part, but because I wasn't very good at it. I kept experiencing myself as really clumsy. Alan didn't make this easier because Alan would basically, when we were playing, treat me the way he treated his mom and his siblings. What is wrong with you, Mike? Why can't you hit that guy? You really stink at this game. You haven't done any practice since our last session, have you? He would just berate and berate and berate me. And I would absorb it and absorb it and absorb it. And I would actually mirror sometimes that his sense of reality was accurate, that I really did suck at this game. But I would keep trying. And over a period of time, he kind of petered out. Over time, the berating and the aggression really kind of decreased. I mean, he didn't have anyone to fight with, so he stopped. And in fact, he was using Call of Duty to build his esteem, often initially at the expense of the other. He was using it as a way of sublimating his aggressive drives. He also was teaching something to me that I wanted you to sort of know about. And I'm going to go back again to this slide. So this is a sniper rifle. And in order for you to do well in Call of Duty, if you're going to snipe, you have to have good impulse control, meaning the minute you see somebody show up in front of your gun, you have to not shoot. You have to see the person and then not shoot and line up the aim in your sight. So in fact, one of the things that I discovered about first-person shooters with Alan is that playing them improves your impulse control. You progress in the game and you work better in the game when you're able to delay your gratification of shooting, to delay your aggression. The other thing that happened is, I did disobey Winnicott's interdiction and offered an interpretation, not when he was berating me, but at a certain point afterwards, I pointed out to him that I often felt like a failure in these video games. I often felt clumsy and not good enough, just like I imagined he often felt at school or at home. And that hit hard. And he was able to acknowledge that, yes, he did feel like he didn't understand. He didn't know how to do things when it was at school or when he was at home. And that, in fact, he felt like he needed to be the dad when his dad wasn't there, and he felt totally incapable of doing it. Over the course of treatment, things changed. He started to enjoy nurturing others. So for example, I agreed at one point to spend a half an hour each week between sessions practicing because I was so bad at Call of Duty. And each week he would check in. And after the checking in, he began to reflect, hey, I can see that you're doing better in the game. Hey, I notice you are doing much better with your shooting. He became nurturing. And in fact, that's when I lowered the boom, because up until then, he had been telling me how useless homework was and how he refused to do it. And he was saying, what's the point of doing homework? And I said, well, it's exactly like the point of practicing Call of Duty. Homework is practice. And, it's how we improve. And his homework completion improved after that. Playing the game that we played, we had options to collaborate or compete, which meant that on some weeks when he was feeling extremely aggressive and angry, we would be playing against each other. And in other weeks when he was feeling more lonely and kind of at sea, we would collaborate and be on the same team. And then gradually aggression became the unnecessary obstacle to competency, and he relinquished it. Gradually, he didn't need to give me a hard time about things, okay? He was excited to start high school. His sleep improved. He decreased the verbal abuse towards mother. and increased complaining about her to me, which again is progress for an adolescent. We want to displace that aggression. He decreased sibling fights. He improved his mood. And he recently told me that he thought his brother needs a mic to talk to. So we stopped playing Call of Duty at that point in the treatment. There was a developmental shift, and he asked me if I could bring in my laptop so we could play some turn-based strategy games, which made it easier for us to talk and play. And so you saw a shift in terms of both his cognitive approach to therapy, his willingness to engage. We started talking about dating and sex and all of those things. Alan at 18 was very different than who I had met. He spent a semester in Central America. He'd successfully completed high school that he was entering with failing grades. He completed a gap year interning at a firm while starting up his own web design business. He started the college of his choice. He's been dating and had multiple friendships. And when last I checked in on him, he had an existing website where he had created a design firm. And his co-founder was the sibling that he used to abuse all the time. So this is a kid that used therapy and used the play of first-person shooters in therapy to successfully discharge drives, to negotiate conflict, and to enter into an intersubjective play state with a benign other. Now imagine if I had looked at him on day one and thought of his first-person shooter work as sublimated masturbation. Imagine if I had been afraid to cross the boundary of practicing outside of the game. Imagine if I hadn't been able to share excitement in sessions when one or both of us killed some zombies. I think he did a lot of really good work in treatment. I miss him. Anyway, that's my book, which I'm not going to shill to you now, but I have time, I think, for some questions. I knew I threw a lot at you. I'm sorry. There's even more slides, but I didn't want to just rush us through. So I'm going to just stop screen sharing now and take some questions if you have any.